Sup guys, in this video I'm going to be analyzing our beloved starter ships from an endgame perspective. Even if you don't care about the starter ships per se, I think there will be something of use in the video. By the way, this is about their performance on auto. If you're wondering about manual, sort them by torpedo damage and that's the entire ranking. If you're a new player who happened to stumble on this video looking for information about the starters, unfortunately you won't understand much of anything. But do know that you can acquire all 4 starters in about a month of gameplay, so just choose the one that you like the most, based on aesthetics, so you can have them as the first ship in your dock when you filter by acquisition date. My personal ranking, based on everything other than gameplay, is Javelin, Z23, Laffey, and then Ayanami, so there may or may not be some bias in the analysis, which I'll let you decide. From all the years that I've been a part of the community, the sentiment has been that Ayanami is the best of the starters, followed by Laffey and Z23, who are tied with Laffey dealing more damage but Z23 being more consistent and sturdy, and Javelin in dead last, not even worth being considered from a gameplay perspective. Despite Javelin having been buffed about 3 times over the years, she never quite managed to beat the allegations of being the weakest starter. Today, I'm finally going to get down to the bottom of it. When comparing ships, it's not enough to just give them the same equipment and just call it a day. Here are a couple examples to illustrate what I mean. Let's say that you have 2 ships that deal the same amount of damage as each other with rudder and toolbox. But ship A with only rudder has the same EHP as ship B with both a rudder and a toolbox, meaning that you could give ship A an Oxytorp and increase her damage significantly without really sacrificing anything. Then, you might not want to give them the same equipment if you're doing a comparison. Another example is Ayanami. Personally, I would always use her with 2 Oxytorps, and maybe I would consider using her with 1 in extreme cases. Obviously, there are cases where you're better off using 2 toolboxes on her, otherwise she would just get eviscerated. But I'm not so invested into using Ayanami regardless of the situation, so instead of using Ayanami with 2 defensive Oxes, which would be like using a fork to eat soup, I would just use a spoon instead. If you are dead set on using Ayanami no matter what, then you shouldn't compare her to other ships since they're irrelevant to your situation and will only cause you stress. It would be the equivalent of you only being willing to use a fork but always thinking about how a spoon would be more efficient. Next, I'm going to talk about the loadout of each ship and their individual strengths on paper, starting with Z23. Do note that I'm assuming all of them are equipped with their respective unique augments, and this is from an endgame perspective. Out of the 4, Z23 has the highest gun damage and lowest torpedo damage and barrage damage. This means that she will scale the hardest with stronger guns, and least with faster guns, torps, and oxytorps. Do note that the Arctic report, which gives 20 FP, is not the firepower equivalent of an oxytorp because of the huge stat differential between the two. So even for a firepower heavy destroyer like Z23, oxytorp will still give a bigger increase. She is also quite sturdy compared to the others, being about tied with Javelin for first place in terms of EHP when both are running 2 toolboxes. Next is Laffey, who is the squishiest of the 4. Her kit rerolls around large reload buffs that increase the damage of all of her guns, torps, and barrages equally. As such, she scales well with strong guns, torps, and oxytorps, but her barrages don't scale well with equipments. Next up is Javelin. Her guns are quite a bit weaker than Z23 and Laffey, but her torps are a lot stronger. Her EX barrage that happens every 20 seconds is also very strong and lines up well with her torpedo cooldown to buff them. As such, she scales extremely well with strong torps and oxytorps, especially since she has the 30% bonus auxiliary stat perk, which gives her another 30 torpedo stat per oxytorp. Lastly, we have Ayanami, who is a true torp ship with next to no firepower damage. Her torps are the strongest out of the 4, and her gun only serves as a way to increase the uptime of her torpedo buff. She scales the best with oxytorps and strong torpedoes, while her main gun never changes from the 76mm blue pea shooter. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at the test results. I tested the ships against Gorizia in EX mode, so the enemy is medium armor with 50 evasion and 50 luck, which is pretty typical of an enemy boss. One thing to keep in mind is that the auto AI runs your entire vanguard forward in the beginning of the battle, so the frontmost ship generally performs the worst, as she has the highest chance of firing her torps into nothing, while the rear ship should perform the best, as the Vanguard will have rebounded back to a reasonable distance by the time she fires her torpedoes. In the first 10 runs, I used what I would consider a budget setup to set the baseline. I was a bit surprised to see that Z23 performed the worst, especially being in the rear, although technically she didn't use the best possible gun available to her, which would be the 135mm Pompeo gun in this case. With the Pompeo gun, I could see her doing about 10% more damage, which would probably put her in the front. I will go into detail about the comparison between the Pompeo gun and Rainbow gun in a future video. Next, I replaced the plus 10 guns and torps with plus 13. As previously mentioned, Laffey scales well with both equipment slots, so you can see that she gained the most from better equipment. Javelin and Z23 gained noticeably less than Laffey, but I think that this is just due to an insufficient sample size and these 10 runs just happen to trend lower due to RNG. This time, if we increase Z23's damage by about 10% to account for Pompeo gun, we see that Laffey will still have overtaken her for first place. In the next 10 runs, I added 1 Oxytorp to all 3 ships. As expected, Javelin now has gotten the biggest increase as she has the best torps, and the auxiliary perk as previously mentioned. We can see that at 1 Oxytorp, Javelin has overtaken the other 2 despite being in the disadvantageous front position. Next, I moved on to 2 Oxytorps. At this point, I don't think there's any point in testing Z23 anymore, as she will not be able to keep up with the others in terms of scaling. I replaced her with Ayanami, whom, as I've said, I would always use with 2 Oxytorps. Once again, we can see that Javelin has gotten a huge bump in damage, while Laffey's increase was more mild in comparison. As expected, Ayanami is dealing the most damage, but due to a few factors, I used these 40 runs just to see if the 76mm would perform better than the Rainbow gun on Ayanami. Within these 2 sets of tests, nothing was changed aside from Ayanami's main gun, but strangely everyone's damage went down with the change, not just Ayanami. We can see that her standard deviation decreased with the 100mm though, so at least that makes a bit more sense. As for the issue with the direct comparison between Ayanami and the other 2, it is quite clear that only Javelin has a chance, but since she's in the lead position while Ayanami is in the rear, it is unfairly skewed toward Ayanami. Not only that, but Ayanami just happened to have enough reload to hit the boss with one last salvo of torpedoes before time ran out, which Javelin couldn't. So the 57-second time frame is again slightly rigged toward Ayanami's favor. In order to combat the issues, I used another consistent ship as a tank as control and shifted Javelin to the rear, while also reducing destroyer fleet tech reload to 0 so that both Ayanami and Javelin would get off the same number of torpedoes. After about 13 runs, I remembered that Plymouth doesn't have preloaded torpedoes, and so I switched the positions of Ayanami and Javelin to make it fair. So they both had exactly 13 runs in the middle position and 13 runs in the rear position. The final result had them very close, but as expected, Javelin did less on average but was more consistent. However, this is only one part of the equation. Since we're against medium armor, we can extrapolate that Javelin would deal more damage against light armor enemies, since gun damage would be more relevant, while Ayanami would deal more against heavy with her specialization in torpedoes. In a similar vein, Laffey and Z23 would also be more competitive against light armor enemies. Yet another factor to consider is that Javelin's barrages contain quite a lot of pierce, so against multiple enemies Javelin can rack up a lot more damage. Also, due to the difference in their max limit break perks, Ayanami will land more torpedoes against a single enemy with her torpedo spread reduction. But if there are multiple enemies, then Javelin will likely land the same number of torpedoes, giving her more of a relative increase. To put this theory to the test, I gave both of them a spin in auxiliary meta, but did not record the runs. Javelin was able to output more damage, but this is only one trial each, so in the following days I will likely continue to run them in auxiliary meta to get a better picture. One last thing to consider is that Ayanami's unique augment offers a huge burst in the opening seconds of the fight. So as the fight drags on, the value decreases. The Gorizia fight has a duration of 57 seconds, so in longer fights Javelin will likely catch up to Ayanami. And for what it's worth, Javelin is also tankier. To sum up all of my testing, I would rate Ayanami and Javelin at about the same level, slightly higher than Z23 and Laffey, who are also about the same. Anyway, although I made this video about the starters, a lot of the concepts I talked about, such as equipment and aux scaling, as well as position and battle duration, are applicable to many other ships and aspects of the game. I hope that you enjoyed the video and that I've left you with something to think about. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.